Hey there, horror enthusiasts. Today, we're going to dive into the world of camping horror, where the chills and thrills are in full swing. So, if you're a fan of the spine-tingling, the pulse-pounding, and the downright scary, then camping horror is definitely your cup of tea. Thanks for joining us today, and don't forget to follow and subscribe for more thrilling content. Stay spooky, my friends. The Carolina sun beat down on my neck as I wiped sweat from my brow. Construction work was never a picnic, but damn, this job was something else. We were clearing land for a new development, some fancy houses for rich folks who wanted a taste of country living. Personally, I'd take a cramped city apartment over this any day. The air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth, and mosquitoes swarmed us constantly. The land was way out in the sticks, miles from anything resembling civilization. Trees stretched as far as the eye could see, thick and tangled, like they were trying to reclaim the earth. Every now and then, we'd scare up some deer or a wild turkey, but mostly it was just us, the machines, and the endless woods. I was operating the bulldozer that day, clearing a section near the edge of the property. The ground was rough, full of roots and rocks, making the dozer buck and shudder. I was concentrating on maneuvering around a particularly gnarly oak when I felt a jarring thud. The whole machine lurched, and the engine sputtered and died. What the hell? I muttered, throwing the gear shift into neutral. I figured I'd hit a rock or something, but this felt different. This felt solid. I climbed down from the cab and walked around to the front of the dozer. The blade was half buried in the dirt, and something metallic glinted in the sunlight. I crouched down, brushing away the loose soil, and my blood ran cold. It was a metal box, old and rusted, half crushed by the weight of the dozer. It looked like it had been buried there for decades, maybe even centuries. I reached out, my fingers tracing the cold, corroded metal. A sense of unease crept over me, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I called over to my foreman, a gruff, no-nonsense guy named Frank. He came over, grumbling about delays and deadlines, but his expression changed when he saw the box. "What the hell is that?" he muttered, squatting down beside me. We carefully dug the box out of the dirt, our hands shaking with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. It was heavy, much heavier than it looked. We pried the lid open, and the hinges creaked like a rusty door. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded velvet, was a silver locket. It was tarnished and worn, but the intricate design was still visible. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. It felt strangely alive. I opened the locket, and inside, I found a lock of hair, brown and brittle with age. And beneath the hair, a faded photograph of a young woman. She was beautiful, with dark eyes and a sad smile. A chill ran down my spine. Who was this woman? And what was her locket doing buried in the middle of nowhere? Frank, being the practical sort, immediately called the site manager. Word traveled fast, and soon we had a whole crowd gathered around the unearthed box, everyone with their own theories about what we'd stumbled upon. Some joked about buried treasure, others about a long-lost moonshine stash. Me, I just felt a growing sense of unease. That locket, the woman in the picture, it all felt wrong. The site manager, a nervous guy named Mr. Henderson, arrived in a flurry of dust and apologies. He took one look at the box in the photo, and his face went pale. He made a few calls, and within a couple of hours, we had a whole team of official-looking folks on site. Archaeologists, they called themselves. They cordoned out the area, shooing us away like pesky flies. We spent the rest of the day milling around, watching as they carefully examined the site. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and all sorts of fancy equipment. It was clear this wasn't just some random buried box anymore. This was something bigger. The archaeologists worked late into the night, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. We huddled around a campfire, the flames casting flickering shadows on our faces. Whispers and rumors flew around like moths. Some of the older guys started talking about local legends, stories about a forgotten graveyard, a place where people disappeared without a trace. I tried to brush it off, but the stories, coupled with the eerie silence of the woods and the distant clinking of the archaeologists' tools, sent shivers down my spine. The woman in the locket, her sad eyes, seemed to haunt my thoughts. The next morning, the archaeologists called us together. They looked grim, their faces edged with. The archaeologists were right. Over the next few days, the whole site transformed into a scene straight out of a horror movie. Those guys, with their little brushes and tiny shovels, they started uncovering graves. Not just one or two, but dozens of them. The ground was littered with skeletal remains, bones bleached white by time, some still clad in scraps of clothing. The mood on the site went from uneasy to downright oppressive. Even the guys who'd been cracking jokes about buried treasure went silent. No one wanted to be anywhere near those graves. Every time a shovel hit the dirt, it felt like we were disturbing something we shouldn't be. I remember one afternoon, I was helping to clear some of the brush away from a newly uncovered grave. The sun was beating down, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something faintly sweet and sickeningly metallic. I bent down to pick up a fallen branch, and that's when I saw it. A skull, staring up at me from the dirt. Empty sockets, a gaping jaw, a few strands of brown hair clinging to the bone. It was a woman's skull, I could tell. And for a moment, I swear, I saw her face superimposed on the bone, her eyes wide with fear, her mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled back, dropping the branch, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, accusing me of disturbing her rest. I wanted to apologize, to tell her I didn't mean any harm, but the words caught in my throat. That night, I had nightmares. I dreamt of skeletal figures rising from the earth, their bony fingers reaching for me, their hollow eyes filled with rage. I woke up in a cold sweat. The image of the woman's skull burned into my mind. The next day, the archaeologists made a grim discovery. They uncovered a mass grave, a pit filled with dozens of skeletons, piled on top of each other. The bones were broken, twisted, showing signs of violence. It wasn't a peaceful burial ground. It was a massacre. The news spread like wildfire through the crew. Whispers of a curse, of restless spirits, filled the air. Some of the guys started talking about quitting, refusing to work on a site that was clearly haunted. Even Frank, the tough foreman, looked shaken. I couldn't blame them. I felt it too, a growing sense of dread, a feeling that we had unleashed something dark and dangerous. We had disturbed the dead, and now they were coming for us. The mass grave changed everything. It wasn't just some old bones anymore. It was a testament to something horrific, something violent. The archaeologists were buzzing with morbid excitement, talking about historical significance and forensic analysis. But for the rest of us, it just felt wrong. Like we were intruding on something sacred, something we weren't meant to see. The excavation continued, but the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. The sun seemed to avoid the site, keeping us shrouded in a perpetual twilight. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, and a constant chill hung in the air, even in the midday heat. Strange things started happening. Equipment malfunctioned for no reason. The bulldozer, the one that had unearthed the first box, refused to start, its engine sputtering and dying. Lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. Tools went missing, only to reappear in strange places. At first, we blamed it on the old equipment, the rough terrain, the stress of the situation. But as the days wore on, the incidents became more frequent, more unexplained. One evening, I was walking back to my truck after a long day of work. The sun had just set, and the woods were dark and silent. I was hurrying along, eager to get back to the motel and wash the grime of the day off me, when I saw something move in the shadows at the edge of the trees. It was a figure, tall and slender, draped in what looked like a long, flowing robe. It stood motionless, its form barely visible in the fading light. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. Was it one of the archaeologists working late? Or something else? I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Hello? Is anyone there?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, silent and still, watching me. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look. But as I moved, the figure vanished, melting back into the shadows. I hurried back to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something unseen was following me. That night, I lay awake in my motel room, listening to the wind howling outside. Every creak of the building, every rustle of leaves, sent shivers down my spine. I felt a presence in the room, a cold, watchful presence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I wasn't the only one. Other guys on the crew started reporting strange occurrences. Whispers in the wind, shadows moving in the periphery, the feeling of being touched by unseen hands. The story spread like wildfire, fueling the growing sense of dread that hung over the site. We had disturbed the dead, and now they were making their presence known. The unease escalated to full-blown fear. Guys were calling in sick, faking injuries, anything to avoid going back to that site. Even Frank, who usually chewed us out for taking a piss break, just shrugged and said, "Do what you gotta do." He looked pale, his eyes bloodshot. I knew he wasn't sleeping any better than the rest of us. The archaeologists, bless their oblivious hearts, seemed immune to the creeping dread. They kept digging, uncovering more and more graves, their excitement growing with every bone they unearthed. They brought in a historian, some old dude with a white beard and a tweed jacket, who started spouting off about colonial history and forgotten settlements. Apparently, this wasn't just any old graveyard. This was the site of a massacre, a brutal one, dating back to the 1700s. The victims were townsfolk, accused of witchcraft and heresy, tortured and executed by their own neighbors. They were thrown into a mass grave, their bodies left to rot. The historian seemed fascinated by the whole thing, talking about dark chapters and historical significance. Me, I just felt sick to my stomach. We weren't just digging up bones. We were digging up the victims of a horrific crime, people who had suffered unimaginable horrors. And now, it seemed, they were restless. The paranormal activity intensified. The whispers in the wind became louder, clearer, almost like voices. Shadows danced at the edge of the woods, taking on the shapes of human figures. Tools flew off shelves, seemingly propelled by unseen hands. One night, it got really bad. I was sleeping in my motel room, the only light coming from the flickering neon sign outside, when I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. Screaming. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched and filled with terror. It echoed through the night, chilling me to the bone. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear where it was coming from. The screaming continued, rising and falling in intensity, like a wave of agony washing over the town. I got out of bed, crept to the window, and peered out into the darkness. The streets were deserted, the only sound the distant barking of a dog. But the screaming continued, relentless and horrifying. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the screams were coming from the burial site. The victims of the massacre were crying out, their voices echoing through the centuries, their pain and terror as real as the day they died. And we, the intruders, the disturbers of their rest, were the only ones who could hear them. The screaming went on for what felt like an eternity. I huddled under the covers, hands clamped over my ears, but it was no use. The sound seemed to pierce through everything, filling my head, my very soul, with terror. I thought about calling the front desk, calling the cops, but what would I say? Hey, I'm hearing ghosts screaming in the middle of the night. They'd probably lock me up in the loony bin. Finally, just as the first hint of dawn crept through the window, the screaming stopped. Silence descended, heavy and oppressive. I lay there, trembling, my body bathed in a cold sweat. I didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. When I got to the site that morning, the atmosphere was even more charged than usual. Everyone looked exhausted, haunted. Even the archaeologists seemed subdued, their usual excitement replaced by a grim determination. The historian, though, he was practically vibrating with energy. He'd spent the night poring over old documents, and he'd uncovered some new information about the massacre. He gathered us around, his eyes gleaming behind his thick glasses. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice trembling with excitement, "I believe we have identified some of the victims." He held up a faded piece of parchment, the ink barely visible. "This is a list of those accused of witchcraft, compiled by the town elders. The names match some of the inscriptions we found on the coffins." He pointed to a name on the list. "Sarah Good, he read. Accused of consorting with the devil, causing illness and misfortune. Burned at the stake, May 19th, 1706. My blood ran cold. Sarah Good. The woman in the locket. The skull I'd seen staring up at me from the dirt. She had a name, a story, a life that had been brutally cut short. The historian continued, reading off names, listing accusations, describing the horrific tortures inflicted on the victims. I listened, my stomach churning, my mind filled with images of those poor souls suffering at the hands of their own neighbors. As he spoke, I felt a presence beside me, a cold spot that seemed to drain the heat from my body. I turned, and there she was. Sarah Good. She stood beside me, her form translucent, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. I could see the flames licking at her feet, the agony etched on her face. She reached out, her hand passing through my arm, and I felt a chill that went straight to my bones. She didn't speak, but her eyes conveyed a message, a plea for justice, a cry for revenge. I understood then. We hadn't just disturbed their rest. We had awakened their anger. And they wouldn't rest until they had their vengeance. After that encounter with Sarah Good, I was a wreck. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything but the ghosts that haunted the site. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure, every whisper in the wind a torture cry. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye, fleeting glimpses of men and women in ragged clothes, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes filled with accusation. The rest of the crew was just as bad. The guys were jumpy, irritable, prone to outbursts. Fights broke out over the smallest things. No one trusted anyone anymore. We were all walking on eggshells, terrified of what we might see or hear next. The work slowed to a crawl. No one wanted to dig anymore. No one wanted to disturb the earth. The archaeologists tried to keep us motivated, talking about the importance of the project, the historical significance of the site. But their words fell on deaf ears. We were all too scared to care. The nights were the worst. The screaming continued every night, echoing through the town, seeping into our dreams. I tried earplugs, sleeping pills, even booze, but nothing could block out the sound of those tortured souls. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bag, threw it in my truck, and started driving. I didn't know where I was going, just away from the ghosts, away from the screams, away from the darkness that had consumed the site. I drove for hours, the road stretching out before me like an endless ribbon. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow on the landscape. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of the screams. I stopped at a rest stop, hoping to get some sleep. But as soon as I closed my eyes, the visions returned. The skull staring up at me from the dirt. Sarah Good, her eyes filled with sadness and accusation. The mass grave filled with the bones of the tortured and murdered. I couldn't escape them. They were everywhere, in my mind, in my dreams, in the very air I breathed. I got back in my truck and kept driving. The sun was starting to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. But the darkness remained, a shadow that followed me, a weight that pressed down on my soul. I didn't know where I was going. or what I would do when I got there. But I knew one thing, I couldn't go back. The site was cursed, haunted by the ghosts of the past. And I was no longer just a witness to their suffering. I was a part of it. Days blurred into a restless, directionless haze. I drove from town to town, sleeping in cheap motels, eating greasy diner food, trying to outrun the memories that clung to me like cobwebs. But there was no escaping the haunted look in the eyes of the waitress who refilled my coffee, no ignoring the whispers that seemed to follow me down empty highways. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the graves, the bones, the faces of the dead. I tried calling Frank a couple of times, but it went straight to voicemail. I figured he was probably avoiding me, like everyone else. Maybe he blamed me for what happened. Hell, maybe I blamed myself. If I hadn't found that damn locket, maybe none of this would have happened. One night, I found myself in a dusty little town somewhere in Oklahoma. I checked into a motel, one of those rundown places with flickering neon signs and stained carpets. I was exhausted, physically and mentally, but sleep was a distant memory. The screaming had followed me, a constant soundtrack to my nightmares. I lay on the bed, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, when I heard a knock at the door. My heart leaped into my throat. Who would be visiting me at this hour? I cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. No one there. Just the dimly lit hallway and the flickering shadows cast by the faulty light fixture. I figured it was just the wind, or maybe some kids messing around. I turned to go back to bed, but then I heard it again. A knock, soft but insistent. This time, I opened the door, and there she was. Sarah Good. She stood in the hallway, her form shimmering like heat haze, her eyes filled with a deep sorrow. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. How did you find me? I stammered. She didn't answer. She just reached out, her hand passing through my chest, and I felt a coldness that seemed to freeze my soul. You cannot escape, she whispered, her voice a mournful sigh. We will not rest until justice is served. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face. But what can I do? I pleaded. They're gone. It's been centuries. Remember us, she said, her voice fading. Tell our story. Let the world know what happened here. And then she was gone, vanished into thin air. I stood there, trembling, the coldness still lingering in my chest. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't outrun the ghosts of the past. I couldn't escape the responsibility for what had happened. I had to tell their story, to give them a voice, to ensure that their suffering was not forgotten. I sat down at the motel's rickety desk, pulled out my laptop, and started writing. I wrote about the clearing, the locket, the graves, the screaming, the faces of the dead. I wrote about Sarah Good and the other victims of the massacre, their lives brutally cut short, their voices silenced for centuries. I wrote until the sun came up, until my fingers ached and my eyes burned. And when I was finished, I knew that I had done what I could. I had honored their memory. I had given them a voice. But I also knew that it wasn't over. The ghosts of the past would always be with me, a reminder of the darkness that lurks beneath the surface of our world. And I would never forget the screams, the cries for justice that echoed through the centuries. I kept driving. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I drifted from town to town, taking odd jobs, never staying in one place for too long. The ghosts followed me, their whispers echoing in my ears, their faces appearing in the shadows. But the screaming had stopped. That was a small mercy, at least. I tried to build a new life, to forget what I'd seen, what I'd done. But the past clung to me like a shroud. I couldn't look at a construction site without seeing the graves, couldn't hear the wind without hearing the whispers, couldn't close my eyes without seeing the faces of the dead. I tried talking to people, therapists, priests, even a psychic. But no one could understand. They looked at me with pity, with concern, sometimes with fear. No one believed my story. I was just a crazy guy, haunted by his own imagination. But I knew the truth. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd felt. The ghosts were real, and they wouldn't let me rest. One day, I found myself back in Carolina. I don't know what drew me there, some morbid curiosity, perhaps, or maybe a subconscious desire to confront my demons. I drove to the site, the old logging road overgrown with weeds, the gate rusted shut. I got out of my truck and stood there, staring at the overgrown field, the wind whispering through the tall grass. It was quiet, eerily quiet. No construction noise, no voices, no screams. Just the wind and the rustling of leaves. I walked towards the site, my heart pounding in my chest. The ghosts were there. I could feel them, their presence a cold weight on my soul. But they were different now, calmer, more peaceful. I reached the mass grave, the crown marked by a simple stone monument. I stood there for a long time, just listening to the wind, remembering the faces of the dead, the stories of their lives, the horror of their deaths. And then I spoke. I remember you, I whispered. I will never forget you. A gust of wind swept through the field, and I felt a sense of release, a lifting of the weight that had been crushing me for so long. The ghosts were at peace, finally. And so was I. I turned and walked away, leaving the past behind me. The ghosts would always be with me, a part of me now. But they were no longer tormenting me. They were a reminder, a warning, a testament to the darkness that humans are capable of. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I would never forget the ghosts of the Carolina clearing. Their story was a part of me now, a story that I would carry with me for the rest of my life. The peace I found at the mass grave was fleeting. The ghosts still whispered, the faces still flickered in the shadows, but the fear had subsided, replaced by a dull ache of sadness and responsibility. I carried their story with me, a burden and a blessing. I started writing more, not just about the Carolina clearing, but about other forgotten tragedies, other whispers of the past. I wrote about the Donner Party, the Salem witch trials, the Trail of Tears. I wrote about the victims, the forgotten, the silenced. My writing found an audience, a small but dedicated group of readers who shared my fascination with the dark side of history. They called me a historian, a researcher, a storyteller. I didn't correct them. Maybe they were right. But the ghosts never left me. They were my constant companions, my shadows, my reminders of the fragility of life and the enduring power of the past. One night, I was working on a new story, the details of a long-forgotten mining disaster swirling in my head when I felt a familiar chill. The air in the room grew heavy, the shadows deepened. I looked up, and there she was. Sarah Good. She stood in the corner of my room, her form more solid than ever before, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice a mournful sigh. I felt a shiver run down my spine. "What do you mean?" "The earth is unquiet," she said. "There are others, restless souls, crying out for justice." I looked at her, my heart pounding in my chest. "What can I do?" "Listen," she said. "Tell their stories. Give them a voice." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the silence of my room. I sat there for a long time, the weight of her words pressing down on me. The ghosts were still out there, their voices whispering in the wind, their stories waiting to be told. I took a deep breath and turned back to my computer. The work was far from over. There were countless stories to be told, countless voices to be heard. And I would be their witness, their chronicler, their voice in the darkness. The ghosts of the past would never be silenced. And neither would I. I've been a search and rescue ranger in the Appalachian Mountains for over 10 years now. I've seen a lot of strange things in that time. Things that I can't explain. But I've never seen anything like what I saw last week. It all started with a call about a lost hiker. A young woman named Emily had gone hiking on the Appalachian Trail and hadn't been seen in 2 days. Her family was frantic. I was assigned to the search party. We started out early the next morning, hiking into the woods where Emily had last been seen. The trail was narrow and winding, and the trees were thick overhead. It was a hot, humid day, and the air was thick with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. We hiked for hours, but we didn't find any sign of Emily. We were about to give up for the day when we came across a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a backpack. It was Emily's. We searched the area, but we couldn't find any other sign of her. We called in the dogs, but they couldn't pick up her scent. It was like she had vanished into thin air. We decided to set up camp for the night. We were all exhausted and discouraged. We didn't know what to do next. As night fell, the forest became eerily quiet. The only sound was the crackling of our campfire. We sat around the fire, talking in hushed voices. We were all scared. We knew that something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was a high-pitched screeching sound. It sounded like an animal in pain. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. "Did you hear that?" I asked. The other rangers nodded. They looked scared. "What was it?" one of them asked. I didn't know, but I had a bad feeling about it. I shone my flashlight into the woods, but I didn't see anything. The screeching sound had stopped. We all stood there for a moment, listening. But there was nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees. We decided to go back to our tents. We were all uneasy, but we were too tired to stay up any longer. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the screeching sound. And I kept thinking about Emily. Where was she? What had happened to her? I didn't know, but I had a feeling that I was going to find out. The next morning, we packed up our camp and continued the search. The mood was somber. We were all starting to think that we would never find Emily. We split up into smaller groups, each taking a different section of the forest. I was partnered with another ranger named Mike. We hiked for hours, calling out Emily's name, but there was no answer. The forest was dense and dark. The trees towered over us, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out the sun. The air was still and humid, and the only sound was the crunching of our boots on the forest floor. I was starting to feel uneasy. I had been in the woods many times before, but I had never felt like this. It was like something was watching us. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything. "You okay?" Mike asked. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said, just a little creeped out. Mike nodded. "I know what you mean. This place gives me the creeps too." We continued hiking. After a while, we came across a stream. We decided to stop and take a break. We sat down on a log and drank some water. I was about to say something when I heard a noise. It was a rustling sound, like something was moving through the bushes. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Mike nodded. "Yeah, I heard it." We shone our flashlights into the bushes, but we didn't see anything. The rustling sound had stopped. We waited for a few minutes, but there was no more noise. We decided to move on. We continued hiking, following the stream. After a while, we came to a clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a large tree. The tree was dead, and its branches were bare. I noticed something strange about the tree. There were scratches on the trunk. Deep, claw-like scratches. "What do you think did that?" Mike asked. I shook my head. "I don't know. But it doesn't look like any animal I've ever seen." We walked closer to the tree. I shone my flashlight on the scratches. They were deep and jagged. They looked like they had been made by something very sharp. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had a bad feeling about this. We circled the tree cautiously, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. The scratches went all the way around the trunk, some of them so deep you could almost fit your fist in. Whatever made these marks was huge and strong as hell. Maybe it was a bear? Mike said, his voice a little shaky. I shook my head. Bears don't have claws like that. These are different. A shiver ran down my spine. The whole clearing felt wrong. The air was heavy, and the silence was so thick it felt like it was pressing down on us. We pushed on, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with every step. The woods were getting darker, the sunlight barely filtering through the dense canopy overhead. After another hour of hiking, we stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was Emily's campsite. Her tent was pitched haphazardly, the flap half open, and her belongings were scattered around. Her sleeping bag lay unrolled, a half-eaten bag of trail mix spilled beside it. "Emily!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the silent trees. No answer. Mike and I exchanged a worried look. This wasn't right. Carefully, we approached the campsite, scanning the area for any sign of her. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of what might have happened. But her things were just left there, like she'd just vanished. "Her phone's gone," Mike said, holding up the empty pocket of her backpack. "But she left her wallet and her keys." That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't human. They were too big, too far apart, and they had this weird, almost three-toed shape. They led away from the campsite, deeper into the woods. "What the hell?" Mike whispered, his face pale. I didn't answer. I just stared at those tracks, a cold dread creeping into my gut. Something was terribly wrong here. Something I couldn't explain. And whatever took Emily, it was still out there, watching us. Just then, a twig snapped in the distance. We both spun around, hearts pounding, flashlights trained on the sound. But there was nothing there. Just the deepening shadows and the unsettling silence of the woods. But then, I heard it. A low, guttural growl deep in the woods, followed by the flapping of massive wings. The sound sent chills down my spine and made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Whatever was out there, it was big. And it was definitely not human. The growl echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. Mike and I exchanged a terrified look. We were both thinking the same thing. Whatever made that sound, it was big and it was close. "We should go," Mike whispered, his voice trembling. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the trees. We didn't want to run. We didn't want to make any sudden movements that might attract whatever was out there. We retreated back down the trail, our flashlights dancing nervously in the growing darkness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept expecting to see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at us from the shadows. We walked for what felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Finally, we came to a small clearing. We stopped in the middle of the clearing, our backs to each other, scanning the trees. "Do you think it's gone?" Mike asked, his voice still shaky. "I don't know," I said, "but I don't think we should stay here for long." Just then, we heard it again. The flapping of wings. It was closer this time, much closer. It sounded like it was right above us. We both looked up, our flashlights searching the sky. But there was nothing there. The canopy was too thick to see anything. Then, I saw it. A shadow. A huge, dark shadow gliding through the trees. It was moving towards us, silently, effortlessly. I pointed my flashlight at the shadow, but the light couldn't penetrate the darkness. I could just make out the shape of a massive creature with huge wings and long, taloned feet. The creature landed on the ground in front of us. It was taller than me, maybe 7 feet tall. It was thin and gaunt, with long, spindly limbs. Its skin was dark, almost black, and it was covered in feathers. But it was the eyes that really got me. They were huge, and they glowed with an eerie yellow light. I had never seen anything like it before. It was like something out of a nightmare. The creature stared at us for a moment, its eyes burning into me. I felt paralyzed with fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Then, the creature let out a deafening screech. It was the same sound I had heard the night before. The sound that had sent chills down my spine. The creature spread its wings and took to the sky. It circled above us for a moment, then disappeared into the darkness. Mike and I just stood there, staring at the spot where the creature had been. We were both speechless. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know," I said. "But I think we just saw a Mothman." The screech echoed through the clearing, bouncing off the trees and sending flocks of birds exploding from their branches. Mike stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. I stood frozen, my flashlight beam trembling in my hand. The Mothman. I couldn't believe it. I'd heard the stories, the whispers around campfires, the legends passed down through generations of Appalachian folk. But seeing it in the flesh, it was different. More terrifying. More real. It was perched on a branch, its glowing eyes fixed on us. The moonlight caught its wings, revealing their immense size and intricate patterns. They weren't like the wings of any bird I'd ever seen. They were leathery, almost bat-like, with feathery edges that fluttered in the night breeze. I could see its body more clearly now. It was humanoid in shape, but grotesquely elongated, with long, thin limbs that ended in sharp talons. Its skin was a dark, mottled gray, almost blending in with the shadows. But those eyes, those were unmistakable. Huge, luminous, and filled with an intelligence that chilled me to the bone. It tilted its head, studying us with an unnerving curiosity. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, like the creature was somehow peering into my mind, dissecting my thoughts and fears. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but stand there exposed under its gaze. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in a nightmare. Then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. With a powerful thrust of its wings, it launched itself into the air, disappearing into the darkness overhead. The sound of its wings faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence that was somehow more terrifying than the screech. Mike scrambled to his feet, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. Did that really just happen?" he stammered. I nodded, my voice caught in my throat. "I think so." We stood there for a long moment, catching our breath and trying to process what we had just witnessed. The clearing felt different now, tainted by the presence of the creature. The air was thick with a strange, metallic scent, and the silence was heavy with unspoken dread. "We need to get out of here," I finally said, my voice hoarse. "Now!" Mike didn't need any further convincing. We turned and ran, stumbling through the undergrowth, our flashlights bouncing wildly in our hands. We didn't stop running until we reached the relative safety of the trail. Even then, we kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting to see the Mothman swooping down from the sky. As we hiked back towards the search party, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been changed by the encounter. We had seen something that defied explanation, something that challenged our understanding of the world. And we knew, deep down, that we would never be the same. We stumbled back to the search party base camp, exhausted and shaken. The other rangers gathered around us, their faces etched with concern. I could see the questions in their eyes, but I didn't know where to begin. How do you explain something like that? Something that defies logic and reason? What happened? The search leader, a grizzled veteran named John, asked, his voice gruff but laced with worry. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. "We saw it, John. The Mothman." A ripple of murmurs went through the group. Some looked skeptical, others fearful. John, however, remained stoic. He'd been a ranger for longer than I'd been alive, and I knew he'd seen his fair share of strange things in these mountains. "Tell me what you saw," he said, his eyes fixed on mine. I recounted the encounter in detail, describing the creature's appearance, its size, its glowing eyes, the eerie screech. Mike chimed in, confirming my account, adding his own observations. When we were finished, a heavy silence fell over the group. John rubbed his chin thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames of the campfire. "I believe you," he finally said, his voice low. "I've heard stories about the Mothman, but I never thought I'd actually meet anyone who'd seen it." He paused, his expression grim. "This changes things. We need to call off the search." A wave of protests erupted from the group. "What about Emily?" someone shouted. "We can't just leave her out there," another cried. John held up his hand for silence. "I know you're all worried about Emily," he said, his voice firm. "But we can't risk anyone else's life. Whatever's out there, it's not something we can handle." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of his decision. I knew he was right, but it didn't make it any easier to accept. We were leaving Emily behind, alone in the darkness, at the mercy of whatever creature lurked in the shadows. The next morning, we packed up our gear and headed back down the mountain. The mood was somber. We had failed to find Emily, and the encounter with the Mothman had left us all feeling uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the creature was still out there, somewhere in the woods, its glowing eyes following our every move. Back in town, I tried to put the experience behind me, but it wasn't easy. The image of the Mothman haunted my dreams, its screech echoing in my ears. I started to research the creature, reading everything I could find about it. The more I learned, the more disturbed I became. The Mothman, it seemed, was more than just a legend. There were countless sightings, dating back centuries. Some people claimed it was a harbinger of doom, a creature that appeared before disasters. Others believed it was an extraterrestrial being, a visitor from another world. Whatever it was clearly something beyond our understanding. I tried to tell my friends and family about what I had seen, but they just laughed it off. They thought I was making it up, or that I was simply stressed out from the search. I couldn't blame them. I would have probably reacted the same way if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew that I would never forget it. The days that followed the search were a blur. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was always elsewhere. I couldn't stop thinking about Emily, about the Mothman, about what it all meant. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying, of the creature swooping down from the sky, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the feeling of dread lingering long after the dream had faded. I knew I couldn't just ignore what I had seen. I needed answers. I started spending my free time at the local library, poring over old books and newspaper articles, anything that mentioned the Mothman. I learned about the legend of the creature, how it was said to be a harbinger of doom, a creature that appeared before disasters. I read about the Silver Bridge collapse in 1967, how many people claimed to have seen the Mothman in the days leading up to the tragedy. The more I learned, the more uneasy I felt. Was the Mothman really a harbinger of doom? Was it responsible for Emily's disappearance? And if so, what was it going to do next? I started to feel like I was being watched. I'd catch glimpses of movement in the shadows, hear the rustle of wings in the trees. I knew it was probably just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. One night, I was driving home from work when I saw something in the rearview mirror. A pair of glowing eyes, staring at me from the darkness. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped out of the car, shining my flashlight into the woods, but there was nothing there. I knew I was starting to lose it. I was seeing things, hearing things. I was obsessed with the Mothman. I needed to get a grip, but I couldn't let it go. I needed to know what happened to Emily. I needed to know what the Mothman was. And I needed to know why it was following me. The obsession was consuming me. Every waking moment was spent researching the Mothman, chasing down every lead, every sighting, every whisper of a story. I drove for hours, crisscrossing the Appalachian back roads, interviewing locals, old-timers who claimed to have encountered the creature, their stories a chilling mix of fear and fascination. One old woman, her eyes cloudy with age, told me about the time she saw the Mothman perched on her barn roof, its eyes glowing like embers in the night. She swore it spoke to her, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. It warned her of a coming storm, a storm that would devastate her town. The storm came just as the creature had foretold, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Another man, a grizzled hunter with weathered hands and a haunted look in his eyes, described his encounter with the Mothman deep in the woods. He claimed the creature had stalked him for days, its shadow flitting through the trees, its eyes always watching. He said it was drawn to fear, feeding off the terror of its victims. Each story, each encounter, added another layer to the mystery. deepening my obsession. I felt like I was getting closer, like I was on the verge of uncovering the truth about the Mothman. But the closer I got, the more terrified I became. I started seeing the creature everywhere. In the shadows of my apartment, in the reflection of my car window, in the faces of strangers on the street. I was losing my grip on reality, the line between sanity and madness blurring with every passing day. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and my hiking boots and headed back to the clearing where I had first encountered the Mothman. I needed to see it again. I needed to know what it wanted from me. The forest was dark and silent, the only sound the crunch of my boots on the leaves. I walked for hours, following the path I had taken that fateful night. Finally, I reached the clearing. The tree where the creature had perched was still there, its branches bare and skeletal against the moonlit sky. I stood in the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the trees, searching for any sign of the Mothman. But there was nothing. Just the silence and the shadows. Then I heard it. A low growl deep in the woods. The same growl I had heard that night. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The growl grew louder, closer. I could feel the creature's presence, its eyes watching me from the darkness. I raised my flashlight, shining it into the trees, but the light couldn't penetrate the gloom. Then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, staring at me from the shadows. The Mothman. I didn't run. I don't know why. Maybe it was the exhaustion, the weeks of sleepless nights and relentless pursuit, or maybe it was something else, a morbid curiosity, a need to finally confront the creature that had haunted my every waking moment. The Mothman stepped out of the shadows, its glowing eyes burning into me. It was even more terrifying up close, its size and presence overwhelming. The leathery wings, the sharp talons, the gaunt, almost skeletal frame, it was like something out of a nightmare, yet here it was, real and tangible. It didn't move, just stood there, its gaze fixed on me. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, the same feeling I had experienced before, like the creature was peering into my mind, reading my thoughts, my fears. Then it spoke. Not with a voice, but with a feeling, a sense of dread that washed over me, chilling me to the bone. It showed me images, flashes of events, of disasters, of people screaming, running, dying. I saw the silver bridge collapsing, the cars plunging into the icy water. I saw fires, floods, earthquakes, a montage of human suffering and despair. And then I saw Emily. She was lying on the ground, her eyes closed, her face pale. She wasn't moving. The Mothman was showing me its power, its connection to these events, to the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the world. It was a harbinger of doom, a bringer of death, and I was its next target. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The creature tilted its head, its eyes following my every move. It was toying with me, savoring my fear. I knew I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, stumbling through the undergrowth, the creature's eyes burning into my back. I could hear its wings flapping behind me, the sound growing louder, closer. I burst out of the clearing and onto the trail, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I didn't look back, just kept running, the image of Emily's lifeless face seared into my mind. I ran until I couldn't run anymore, collapsing on the side of the trail, gasping for air. I lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the forest, the wind rustling through the leaves, the owls hooting in the distance. But there was another sound, a faint scratching, coming from the trees. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching grew louder, closer. Something was moving through the undergrowth, something big, something with claws. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but the light couldn't penetrate the darkness. Then I saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, staring at me from the shadows. The Mothman had found me. The Mothman was closer now, its eyes burning like hot coals in the darkness. I could hear its ragged breathing, the rustle of its wings as it shifted its weight from one lone foot to the other. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to think, had to find a way out of this. I raised my flashlight, the beam shaking in my trembling hand. The light caught the creature's eyes, and for a moment I saw something flicker in their depths, a hint of recognition, curiosity. It was hard to tell, but it wasn't the pure malice I had expected. Then it did something unexpected. It reached out with one of its long, clawed hands, not towards me, but towards the tree behind me. I followed its gaze and saw it, a symbol carved into the bark, a series of intricate lines and circles that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. I had seen that symbol before. In my research, in the old books and articles about the Mothman. It was a warning, a sign of impending doom. But why was the creature showing it to me? Before I could even form a coherent thought, the Mothman screeched, a sound that pierced the silence of the forest, sending a flock of birds scattering into the night sky. It then turned and, with a powerful beat of its wings, vanished into the darkness. I was left alone, standing in the clearing, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. I stared at the symbol on the tree, trying to make sense of it all. Was the Mothman trying to warn me? Or was it something more sinister, a way of marking me, claiming me as its next victim? I didn't know. But I knew one thing, I couldn't stay there. I had to get out of the woods, away from the creature, away from the symbol, away from the darkness that seemed to be closing in on me. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached my car. I jumped in, slammed the door, and locked it, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I drove all night, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the image of the symbol burned into my mind. I haven't been back to the woods since. I quit my job as a ranger, moved to a new town, tried to start a new life. But the memories haunt me, the fear lingers, and I know, deep down, that I will never truly escape the shadow of the Mothman. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls and the trees creak, I see those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness, and I wonder if the creature is still out there, waiting for me to return. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, casting long, eerie shadows across the trail. I should have known better than to start a hike this late in the day, but I'd been so eager to get out on the trail after being cooped up in the city all week. Now, The fading light was making it hard to see the trail markers, and the dense woods were pressing in on either side, making me feel claustrophobic. We should have downloaded that offline map. Like I said, I muttered to my husband, Mark. He was a few paces ahead of me, his tall frame moving with an easy confidence that I didn't feel. Relax, he said, glancing back at me with a reassuring smile. We'll find our way back. It's not like we're going to get eaten by a bear or anything. I forced a laugh, but my heart wasn't in it. The woods were getting darker by the minute, and the silence was broken only by the rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig. I kept imagining eyes watching us from the shadows, and every time a branch creaked, I jumped. We continued on for what felt like hours, but the trail seemed to be getting more and more obscure. The trail markers were few and far between, and I was starting to think we'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. Mark, I said, my voice tight with anxiety. I think we're lost. He stopped and turned to face me, his smile gone. Lost? Don't be ridiculous. We just need to backtrack a little. But as we turned to retrace our steps, we realized that the trail behind us had vanished. There was no sign of the path we'd taken, just an endless expanse of trees and undergrowth. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. We were lost, and night was falling fast. The darkness was closing in fast, swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. The air grew colder, and a damp mist started to rise from the forest floor. I shivered, pulling my thin jacket tighter around me. Fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. Mark, I'm scared, I whispered, my voice trembling. He put his arm around me, trying to sound brave. It's okay, we'll be fine. We just need to find somewhere to shelter for the night. We stumbled through the undergrowth, our feet catching on roots and rocks. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden danger, and the silence was filled with unseen threats. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, Mark stopped abruptly. Look, he whispered, pointing through the trees. I followed his gaze and saw a faint light flickering in the distance. It was a small, yellow light, like a candle flame, and it seemed to be moving. What is it? I whispered, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. I don't know, Mark replied, his voice hushed. But it could be a house. Come on, let's check it out. We pushed through the trees, following the light. As we got closer, the light grew brighter, and we could see that it was indeed coming from a house. It was a small, wooden cabin nestled amongst the trees. It looked old and abandoned, but the light in the window gave us a glimmer of hope. We approached the cabin cautiously, our footsteps muffled by the soft earth. As we got closer, I noticed a strange smell in the air. It was a musky, animalistic scent, like nothing I'd ever smelled before. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We reached the front door, and Mark raised his hand to knock. But before he could touch the wood, the door creaked open, revealing a dark and empty doorway. Hesitantly, we stepped through the doorway into the dimly lit cabin. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and damp wood, and a strange, almost sweet undertone hung beneath it. It was the same musky scent I'd noticed outside, but stronger now, making my nostrils tingle. Mark pulled out his phone and switched on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the gloom. The cabin was a single room, sparsely furnished with a rough-hewn table and a couple of rickety chairs. A fireplace dominated one wall, filled with cold ashes and a few charred logs. Cobwebs hung in every corner, and dust lay thick on every surface. It looked like no one had been here in years. "Hello?" Mark called out, his voice echoing in the silence. "Is anyone here?" There was no reply. Only the creaking of the floorboards beneath our feet and the whisper of the wind outside. I shivered, feeling a prickle of unease crawl down my spine. "This place gives me the creeps," I whispered. "Maybe we should just go." Mark nodded, but his eyes were fixed on a doorway at the back of the cabin. "Let's just check out the rest of the place first," he said. "See if we can find any blankets or something to keep warm." He moved towards the doorway, and I reluctantly followed. The room beyond was a small bedroom, barely big enough to hold a double bed and a battered wooden chest. The bed was covered in a faded patchwork quilt, and a single, dusty window looked out onto the dark woods. As I stepped into the room, I noticed something strange. There were large, deep scratches on the wooden floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. And on the wall beside the bed, there was a handprint. But it wasn't a human handprint. It was far too large, with long, thick fingers. My breath caught in my throat. "Mark," I whispered, pointing at the handprint. "Look at that." He turned, his face pale in the flashlight beam. "What the?" he began, but before he could finish his sentence, we heard a noise from downstairs. It was a low, guttural growl, deep and menacing. It seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin, vibrating through the floorboards and up into our bones. We froze, our blood turning to ice. Something was down there with us. And it was not human. The growl ripped through the silence again, closer this time, sending a jolt of fear through me. I grabbed Mark's arm, my fingers digging into his flesh. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I don't know, but it came from downstairs." We stood there for a moment, listening intently, but the only sound was the pounding of our own hearts. Then, slowly, we began to back away from the bedroom, our eyes fixed on the doorway. As we reached the main room, the growl came again, louder and more menacing than before. It was followed by a heavy thud, like something large had shifted its weight. We exchanged a terrified look, and then, as if on cue, we both turned and ran. We scrambled back through the front door, stumbling over the uneven threshold and out into the night. The cold air hit us like a slap, and we plunged into the darkness, our only guide the dim light of the moon filtering through the trees. We didn't stop running until we were far away from the cabin, our lungs burning and our legs aching. Finally, we collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath. We lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night, our fears slowly giving way to exhaustion. "What was that thing?" I whispered, my voice still trembling. Mark shook his head. "I don't know." But it was big. And it was angry. We sat in silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. We were lost, alone in the woods, and something was out there, watching us. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice firming with resolve. "We need to find our way back to the trail." Mark nodded. "You're right. We can't stay here." We got to our feet, our bodies stiff and sore. We looked around, trying to orient ourselves, but the trees all looked the same in the darkness. We were lost, and we had no idea which way to go. Just when we were about to give in to despair, we saw it. A light. A small, flickering light in the distance. It was the same light we had seen before, the light that had led us to the cabin. We looked at each other, a glimmer of hope dawning in our eyes. Maybe it wasn't a house after all. Maybe it was a ranger station or a campsite. Maybe it was our way out of this nightmare. With renewed determination, we started walking towards the light, our hearts filled with a fragile hope. But as we got closer, the light began to move, and we realized that it wasn't a stationary light at all. It was something else. Something that was coming towards us. The light was bobbing and weaving through the trees, getting closer with every passing second. It was like a firefly, but much larger, and it cast an eerie glow on the surrounding foliage. As it drew nearer, we could see that it wasn't a light at all, but a pair of eyes. Huge, luminous eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness and bore into our souls. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. The eyes stopped moving, hovering just beyond the trees, watching us. We could feel the creature's presence, a palpable sense of power and menace that made our blood run cold. Then, slowly, the creature stepped out from behind the trees. It was enormous, towering over us like a giant. Its fur was dark and matted, and its muscles rippled beneath its thick hide. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and its breath came out in ragged gasps. We stared at the creature in horror, our minds unable to comprehend what we were seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare, a creature of myth and legend come to life. The creature took a step towards us, and we instinctively backed away. It raised its massive hand, and we cowered in fear, expecting to be struck down. But instead, the creature reached out and gently touched Mark's face. Mark flinched, but the creature didn't harm him. It simply stared at him with its deep, intelligent eyes, as if trying to communicate something. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. We were left standing there, alone in the woods, our minds reeling from what we had just witnessed. We didn't speak for a long time. We just stood there, staring into the darkness, trying to make sense of what had happened. Finally, I broke the silence. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark shook his head. "I don't know," he replied, his voice equally shaky. "But I think it was trying to help us." I looked at him in disbelief. Help us? How could it possibly help us? Mark shrugged. "I don't know." But it didn't hurt us, and it led us away from the cabin. He was right. The creature had led us away from the cabin, and now we were no longer lost. We could see the trail in the distance, and we knew that we were safe. We walked towards the trail, our hearts filled with gratitude for the strange creature that had saved us. We didn't know what it was or why it had helped us, but we were grateful nonetheless. As we reached the trail, we turned back to look for the creature, but it was gone. There was no sign of it anywhere. We continued on our way, our minds still reeling from the encounter. We had seen something that we couldn't explain, something that defied all logic and reason. We had seen a Bigfoot. We followed the trail for what felt like hours, the encounter with the creature replaying in our minds like a broken record. Every time a branch snapped or an owl hooted, I jumped, expecting to see those glowing eyes again. Mark, though shaken, seemed strangely calm. He kept glancing back towards the dense woods, almost expectantly, as if waiting for the creature to reappear. Finally, just as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky a pale gray, we stumbled upon a dirt road. Relief washed over me, so intense it almost brought me to my knees. We were no longer lost. We could flag down a car, call for help, get back to civilization. But as we walked along the road, a sense of unease started to creep back in. Something felt off. The woods on either side seemed to press in closer than before, the silence heavier, more oppressive. And then we saw it. A house. It was set back from the road, hidden amongst the trees. A small wooden cabin, almost identical to the one we had found the night before. Smoke curled from its chimney, a thin wisp against the gray sky. That's the same cabin, I stammered, my voice catching in my throat. Mark stared at the cabin, his brow furrowed. No, it can't be. We walked for miles. There's no way. He trailed off, his gaze fixed on the front door. It was slightly ajar, and through the gap, we could see a figure moving inside. A tall, hulking figure, covered in dark hair. My blood ran cold. It was the creature. But it wasn't alone. We crept closer, keeping to the shadows of the trees. Through the window, we could see more figures moving around inside the cabin. They were all similar to the first creature, tall and hairy, with long, powerful limbs. They were gathered around a rough-hewn table, eating. Eating what? I couldn't tell. But the sight of them, these creatures of myth and legend, sitting around a table like a normal family, sent a shiver down my spine. Mark grabbed my hand, his grip tight. We need to get out of here, he whispered. But as we turned to leave, we heard a noise from inside the cabin. A high-pitched, childlike cry. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. We looked back at the window, and our breath caught in our throats. There, sitting at the table with the other creatures, was a small child. A human child. The child's cry was like a punch to the gut. It was a sound of pure terror, and it sent a wave of panic through me. I looked at Mark, and I could see the same horror reflected in his eyes. We had to do something. We couldn't just leave the child in there with those creatures. But what could we do? We were unarmed, outnumbered, and outmatched. We were no match for those creatures. We crept closer to the cabin, trying to get a better look inside. The child was still crying, and we could hear the other creatures talking in low, guttural voices. We couldn't understand what they were saying, but it sounded angry. Suddenly, one of the creatures stood up and walked towards the window. We ducked down, hiding behind a bush, our hearts pounding in our chests. The creature peered out the window, its eyes scanning the woods. We held our breath, praying that it wouldn't see us. After a moment, the creature turned away from the window and went back to the table. We let out a sigh of relief, but we knew that we couldn't stay there for long. We had to find a way to get that child out of there. But how? We looked around, trying to come up with a plan. There was a small shed behind the cabin. Maybe we could find something in there to use as a weapon. We crept towards the shed, keeping low to the ground. We reached the shed and slowly opened the door. The shed was dark and dusty. We could barely see anything. We fumbled around, trying to find something, anything, that we could use. Suddenly, I felt something cold and hard in my hand. I pulled it out, and my heart leaped with joy. It was an axe. I showed the axe to Mark, and his eyes whitened. "This could work," he whispered. We crept back towards the cabin, the axe held tightly in my hand. We reached the front door and slowly opened it. The creatures were still sitting around the table, eating. The child was now quiet, but we could see tears streaming down its face. We stepped into the cabin, our hearts pounding in our chests. The creatures looked up, their eyes widening in surprise. I raised the axe above my head and let out a scream. The creatures' heads snapped up, their eyes locking onto the axe in my hand. A low growl rumbled through the room, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. The largest of the creatures, the one we'd seen outside, rose to its feet, its massive form blocking the light from the window. Before it could take a step towards us, Mark shoved me behind him, putting himself between me and the creatures. "Run!" he yelled, his voice hoarse with fear. I didn't hesitate. I turned and sprinted out of the cabin, the axe still clutched in my hand. I could hear Mark close behind me, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. We burst out of the cabin and into the woods, the creatures' roars echoing behind us. We didn't look back, didn't stop running until we were deep within the trees, the cabin out of sight. We collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath, our bodies trembling with fear and adrenaline. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears, and my lungs burned with every breath. "We have to keep going," Mark gasped, his voice ragged. "They'll be after us." He was right. We couldn't stay there. We had to get as far away from that cabin as possible. We struggled to our feet and stumbled through the undergrowth, our legs aching, our clothes torn by branches. We didn't know where we were going, but we knew we had to keep moving. The sounds of the creature's pursuit faded behind us, but the fear remained, a cold knot in my stomach. I kept imagining them closing in on us, their long arms reaching out to grab us. We ran until we could run no more, until we collapsed onto the forest floor, exhausted and terrified. We huddled together for warmth, listening to the sounds of the forest, our eyes darting around in the darkness, searching for any sign of our pursuers. The night stretched on, an eternity of fear and uncertainty. But as the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees, a sense of hope began to flicker within me. We had survived the night. We had escaped the creatures. But as the light grew stronger, we saw something that made our blood run cold. We weren't alone. The rising sun revealed our surroundings in stark detail. We were in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees. And standing at the edge of the clearing, watching us with those unnervingly intelligent eyes, was the creature that had led us away from the cabin. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, partially hidden by the trees, were more of its kind. Dozens of them. They stood motionless, their dark figures blending with the shadows, their eyes fixed on us. A wave of terror washed over me, colder and more intense than any I had felt before. We were surrounded. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The creature at the front of the group stepped forward, its gaze unwavering. It raised its hand, and the other creatures followed suit. They began to move towards us, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. We scrambled to our feet, our hearts pounding in our chests. We turned to run, but it was no use. The creatures were faster, stronger. They closed in on us, their long arms reaching out. I screamed, my voice raw with terror. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But it never came. I opened my eyes to see the creatures surrounding us, their faces inches from ours. They were sniffing us, their breath hot and rank on our skin. Their eyes, though still unnerving, seemed to hold a flicker of curiosity rather than malice. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they turned and walked away, melting back into the shadows of the forest. We were left standing there, alone in the clearing, our bodies trembling with fear and exhaustion. We didn't speak for a long time. We just stood there, staring at the spot where the creatures had disappeared, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "I think they were just curious," he said, his voice shaky. I looked at him, my eyes wide with disbelief. Curious? They almost caught us. "I know," he replied, "but they didn't hurt us. They just wanted to see what we were." He was right. They hadn't hurt us. They could have easily killed us, but they didn't. Why? We didn't have an answer. But one thing was clear. We had stumbled into something far bigger than ourselves, something that we didn't understand. We had entered a world where the lines between myth and reality were blurred, where creatures of legend walked the earth. And we would never be the same. We made it out of the woods. Somehow. I don't remember much of the journey, just a blur of fear and exhaustion. We stumbled onto a road, flagged down a passing truck driver who looked at us like we were crazy, and finally made it back to civilization. The police, of course, didn't believe our story. Lost hikers, they said. Dehydration, maybe some wild hallucinations. They gave us blankets, warm drinks, and a ride back to our car. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be after what we'd experienced. We both went back to work, tried to reintegrate into our routines. But something had shifted. The world felt different, sharper, more menacing. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see those glowing eyes peering at me from the darkness. I started seeing things in the periphery of my vision, hearing things in the dead of night. Mark was different too. He was withdrawn, quiet. He spent hours staring out the window, lost in thought. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with a strange expression on his face, an expression I couldn't quite decipher. One night, I woke to find him gone. His side of the bed was cold, the sheets rumpled. I got up and searched the house, but he was nowhere to be found. I went to the window and looked out at the street. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the lawns. And standing at the edge of the woods, at the end of our street, was a figure. Tall, dark, unmistakable. It raised its hand, beckoning me to follow. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Fear warred with a strange sense of longing, a pull towards the unknown. Then, I turned away from the window and went back to bed. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the image of the creature, the memory of the woods. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. I've been a park ranger in Yosemite for 5 years now, and I still can't get over how damn beautiful this place is. Every morning, I wake up to the smell of pine needles and the sound of birds chirping. It's paradise, pure and simple. But even paradise has its dark corners, and I guess you could say I'm paid to keep an eye on those corners. Today started like any other. I grabbed my gear, checked the radio, and headed out on patrol. My assigned area was Cathedral Lake, a popular spot for hikers and campers. The trail winds through a dense forest of pines and firs, eventually opening up to the lake, this pristine, glassy expanse of water reflecting the granite cliffs towering above. It's usually bustling with activity this time of year, but today it was eerily quiet. Almost too quiet. The first thing I noticed was the lack of cars in the parking lot. Just a lone beat-up Jeep with faded paint. Weird, considering it was a Saturday in peak season. I shrugged it off, figuring maybe folks were sleeping in or something. But as I started down the trail, a knot of unease began to tighten in my gut. Something just felt off. The air was still, no rustling leaves or birdsong, just a heavy silence that pressed down on me. And the shadows from the trees seemed deeper, darker than usual. I kept scanning the trail, half expecting to see a bear or mountain lion, but there was nothing. Just that unsettling quiet. By the time I reached the lake, the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. The water was still like a sheet of glass, not a ripple disturbing the surface. No one was swimming, no one was fishing, no one was even sunbathing on the rocks. Just that damn Jeep parked near the trailhead, looking abandoned. I pulled out my radio, intending to check in with the station, but the signal was all static. Great, just great. Now I was officially creeped out. I decided to check out the Jeep, see if I could find any clues about who it belonged to. As I got closer, I noticed something strange hanging from the rearview mirror, a small, crudely made doll with a bell attached to its neck. It looked old, almost antique, and something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I was about to reach for the door handle when I heard a sound from the woods, a faint, high-pitched ringing, like a tiny bell. I froze, every sense on high alert. The ringing came again, closer this time, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I wasn't alone. That ringing sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I spun around, scanning the tree line, trying to pinpoint the source. The woods were thick, shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I couldn't see anything, but the ringing continued, faint and elusive, like it was moving through the trees. My hand instinctively went to my holster, resting on the butt of my service weapon. I felt a surge of fear, but also a strange sense of curiosity. What the hell was going on? Was it some kids messing around? Or something else? I decided to investigate. Gripping my flashlight, I cautiously moved towards the sound, pushing aside branches and stepping over fallen logs. The ringing grew louder with each step, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the distance, a fleeting glimpse of something white darting between the trees. It was too quick to make out any details, but it definitely wasn't a deer or any other animal I recognized. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed on, following the sound and the occasional flash of light. The forest seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavy and oppressive. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, like I was being watched. Suddenly, the ringing stopped. I froze, listening intently. The silence was deafening. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. Then, a voice. "Lost, Ranger?" It was a whisper, soft and raspy, seemingly carried on the wind. I couldn't tell where it came from. It seemed to surround me. I whirled around, shining my flashlight in every direction, but there was nothing there. Just the dense, shadowy woods. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. Only the rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the creek. I felt a cold dread creeping up my spine. This was no ordinary prank. Something was out there, something unseen, and it knew my name. The voice whispered again, closer this time. "They never leave." A wave of dizziness washed over me. The ground seemed to sway beneath my feet. I stumbled back, my hand grasping at a tree trunk for support. "Who are you talking about?" I managed to choke out. "Who never leaves?" But there was no reply. Only the wind sighing through the trees, carrying with it a sense of impending doom. I stumbled back to the trail, my mind reeling. Who was that? What did they mean, "they never leave"? I felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition that something terrible had happened. I hurried back to the lake, the image of that creepy doll hanging from the Jeep's mirror burned into my mind. I needed to get back to the station, report this, get some backup. But as I approached the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The Jeep was gone. I blinked, convinced I was seeing things. 1 minute it was there, the next it was gone. Vanished without a trace. I checked the ground, looking for tire tracks, but there was nothing. Just the undisturbed dirt and pine needles. Panic started to rise in my throat. This was beyond weird. This was straight up freaky. I fumbled for my radio again, desperately trying to get a signal, but all I got was static. Then I noticed something else. Near the spot where the Jeep had been parked, there was a small, faded backpack lying on the ground. It was a child's backpack, bright pink with a cartoon unicorn on it. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random weirdo messing with me. There was a kid involved. I cautiously approached the backpack, my hand hovering over my holster. I knelt down and gently unzipped it. Inside, I found a few crayons, a half-eaten bag of gummy bears, and a small, worn teddy bear. My heart sank. This was a real kid with a real family, and they were gone. I scanned the area again, desperately searching for any sign of life, any clue as to what had happened. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of the forest and the growing feeling that I was caught in something far beyond my understanding. I had to get help. I had to find out who that kid was and what happened to them. I sprinted back down the trail, the image of that pink backpack seared into my memory. As I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes were following my every move. And that whispering voice echoed in my mind, "They never leave, they never leave." I burst out of the tree line, gasping for breath, my legs burning. I fumbled for my radio again, praying for a signal, but still nothing but static. Damn it. I needed to get to a higher elevation. I scrambled up a rocky outcrop, desperation clawing at me. The pink backpack, the Jeep vanishing into thin air, the whispering voice, it all swirled in my head, making my stomach churn. Finally, at the top of the outcrop, I managed to catch a faint signal. "Ranger Station, this is Ranger Miller. Do you copy?" I shouted into the radio, my voice hoarse. A crackle of static, then a voice, blessedly clear. "Ranger Miller, this is dispatch. What's your status?" "Dispatch, I need backup at Cathedral Lake ASAP. Possible missing persons. I repeat, possible missing persons." "Missing persons? Can you confirm?" I found an abandoned child's backpack, and a Jeep that was in the parking lot just vanished. Something's not right here. Dispatch. Copy that, Ranger Miller. We're sending a unit your way. Can you provide any further details? I quickly relayed the events of the last hour, the empty trail, the Jeep, the doll, the ringing, the voice, the disappearing vehicle. The dispatcher was silent for a moment, then said, "Ranger Miller, are you sure you're all right? Do you need medical assistance?" "I'm fine, dispatch. Just get someone out here now." I snapped, feeling a surge of frustration. Did they think I was making this up? Unit 12 is en route, ETA 20 minutes. Stay put and maintain visual contact with the area, Ranger Miller. Copy that, I said, my voice tight. 20 minutes. That felt like an eternity. I scanned the lake again, my eyes searching for any sign of movement, any clue. The sun was starting to dip below the tree line, casting long shadows across the water. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, carrying with it an eerie, mournful sound. Suddenly, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small, wooden boat drifting aimlessly near the far shore of the lake. It looked old, almost ancient, with a single oar resting across the seats. My heart pounded in my chest. Was that there before? I couldn't be sure. But something about that boat, its silent presence on the still water, sent a shiver down my spine. I kept my eyes glued to the boat, watching as it drifted closer and closer to the shore. And as the shadows lengthened and the wind howled through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something evil was lurking nearby, watching me, waiting for its moment to strike. My eyes were glued to that boat. It drifted closer and closer, the gentle lapping of water against its wooden hull the only sound that broke the silence. The setting sun cast an eerie glow on the water, making the boat seem almost spectral. I raised my binoculars, trying to get a better look. There was definitely something inside. A figure hunched over in the stern, shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but it seemed to be wearing a long, flowing garment like a robe. My pulse quickened. Who the hell was that? And how did they get there? There was no one else at the lake. I would have seen them. The boat scraped against the shore, the figure remaining motionless. I hesitated, unsure what to do. Should I approach? Call out? Or wait for backup? But something inside me, some primal instinct, urged me forward. I had to know who was in that boat. I had to know what was going on. I cautiously made my way down the rocky outcrop, keeping my eyes fixed on the figure. As I got closer, I could see that it was a woman, her face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. She sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap. I stopped a few feet away, my voice catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I help you?" The woman didn't respond. She didn't even move. It was like she was a statue, carved from wood. I took another step closer, my hand hovering over my holster. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Still no response. I was about to reach out and touch her shoulder when she suddenly looked up. The hat shadowed her face, but I could see her eyes, two dark, piercing orbs that seemed to bore into my soul. A chill ran down my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about those eyes, something ancient and malevolent. The woman slowly rose to her feet, her gaze never leaving mine. She raised her hand, pointing a long, bony finger at me. And then she spoke. Her voice was a low, guttural growl, like something from the depths of the earth. "You should not have come here," she rasped. "This is my domain." I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. Who was this woman? What did she want? The woman stepped out of the boat, her feet sinking into the soft earth. She moved with an unnatural grace, like a predator stalking its prey. "You will not find them," she said, her voice echoing across the lake. "They belong to me now." I felt a surge of fear, cold and paralyzing. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this woman was not human. She was something else, something ancient and evil. And she was coming for me. Fear jolted me into action. I didn't wait to see what this woman, this thing, was going to do. I turned and ran, scrambling back up the rocky outcrop, my boots slipping on the loose gravel. Adrenaline surged through me, but my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw her gliding towards me, impossibly fast, her long robe billowing behind her like a shroud. "You cannot escape," her voice rasped, echoing across the lake. "They never leave." Panic clawed at my throat. I stumbled, falling to my hands and knees, the sharp rocks digging into my flesh. I scrambled back to my feet, my eyes darting around for an escape route. But there was nowhere to go, just the sheer cliff face and the dark, menacing woods. She was closing in, her eyes burning with an unholy light. I could feel her presence, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on me. Desperation gave me a burst of speed. I scrambled up the last few feet of the outcrop, reaching the top just as she reached the bottom. She looked up at me, her face contorted in a mask of rage. "You will regret this," she hissed. "You will all regret this." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and plunged into the woods, branches whipping in my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. I didn't care. I just had to get away from that woman, from that lake, from that cursed place. I ran blindly, my lungs screaming for air, my legs aching with exhaustion. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me like a cage. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps soft but relentless, like a predator stalking its prey. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, driven by pure, primal fear. The image of that woman, her eyes, her voice, her words haunted me, fueling my desperate flight. I didn't know how long I ran, but eventually the trees began to thin. I stumbled out onto a dirt road, my legs giving way beneath me. I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath, my body racked with sobs. I was safe, for now. But I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was not over. That woman, that creature, would not give up so easily. She would find me. She would make me regret this. And the chilling words echoed in my mind. They never leave. They never leave. I lay on the dirt road, my chest heaving, until the panic subsided and the shaking stopped. The woods were silent now, no sign of the woman, no echoing whispers. But the fear lingered, a cold knot in my gut. I pulled myself to my feet, my body aching, my clothes torn and bloody from the thorns. I had to get back to the station, report what I'd seen. But first, I needed to find my bearings. I had no idea where I was, how far I'd run. I stumbled down the road, hoping to find a landmark, a sign, anything familiar. The sun had set, and the moon cast long, eerie shadows across the landscape. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After what felt like an eternity, I saw headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me. I staggered towards the road, waving my arms. The truck pulled over, and a park ranger jumped out. It was Johnson, a young guy, fresh out of the academy. He looked at me, his eyes widening in alarm. "Miller, what the hell happened to you?" I could barely speak. I just pointed back towards the lake, gasping for breath. "There's a woman, the lake." Johnson helped me into the truck, his face creased with concern. He radioed the station, reporting my location and requesting medical assistance. I slumped back in the seat, exhaustion overwhelming me. I closed my eyes, but the image of the woman in the boat, her piercing eyes, her chilling words haunted my thoughts. When I opened my eyes, we were back at the station. The paramedics were checking me over, asking me questions, but I could barely focus. All I could think about was that woman, the missing Jeep, the pink backpack. Johnson sat beside me, his hand on my shoulder. "Miller, what happened back there? What did you see?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I told him everything: the empty trail, the vanishing Jeep, the doll, the ringing, the whispering voice, the woman in the boat, her chilling words. Johnson listened intently, his expression grave. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. That's unbelievable," he finally said. "But I believe you. Something strange is going on out there." He told me that Unit 12 had arrived at the lake, but they hadn't found any sign of the woman, the boat, or the missing Jeep. They did, however, find the pink backpack near the shore. And they found something else. A campsite abandoned in haste. A tent ripped and torn. Signs of a struggle. And a small child's shoe lying discarded on the ground. My blood ran cold. The woman's words echoed in my mind: "You will not find them. They belong to me now." Johnson squeezed my shoulder. "We're going to find them, Miller. We're going to find out what happened." But deep down, I knew that we wouldn't. They were gone, taken by something ancient and evil, something that lurked in the shadows of the forest, something that whispered on the wind. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that they would never leave. The next few days were a blur. I was put on medical leave, something about shock and trauma. They gave me some pills to help me sleep, but the nightmares kept coming. The woman in the boat, the pink backpack, the abandoned campsite, it all played on repeat in my head. Johnson visited me a few times, filling me in on the investigation. They hadn't found any trace of the missing family, no bodies, no car, no clues. It was like they vanished off the face of the earth. The official story was that they'd gotten lost in the woods and succumbed to the elements. A tragic accident. Case closed. But I knew better. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. One evening, Johnson came by with a somber look on his face. He sat down heavily in the chair beside my bed. "Miller," he said, "I've been doing some digging. There's something you should know about Cathedral Lake. Something they don't teach you in ranger school." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "There's an old legend, a local story. They say the lake is haunted. Haunted by a witch." I felt a chill run down my spine. "A witch?" "Yeah," Johnson said. "They call her the Bell Witch. The story goes that she was a woman who lived in the woods centuries ago. She was accused of witchcraft and burned at the stake. But before she died, she cursed the lake, vowing to take revenge on anyone who dared to trespass on her land. The bell." I whispered, remembering the doll hanging from the Jeep's mirror, the ringing in the woods. Yeah, Johnson said. They say she lures people into the woods with the sound of a bell. And then she takes them. I close my eyes, the woman's words echoing in my mind. You should not have come here. This is my domain. They say she keeps their souls trapped at the bottom of the lake, Johnson continued. That's why they never leave. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The legend was true. The bell witch was real. And she had taken that family. Why didn't anyone tell me about this? I asked, my voice hoarse. Johnson shrugged. They say it's just a story, a campfire tale to scare the tourists. But I think there's more to it than that. I think there's something dark and ancient in those woods, something we don't understand. He looked at me, his eyes filled with concern. Miller, you need to be careful. That witch, she knows you saw her. She knows you interfered. She might come looking for you. I felt a shiver of fear run down my spine. The Bell Witch. She was real. And she was out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for her moment to strike. Johnson's words stuck with me, a chilling prophecy hanging over my head. The Bell Witch knew I'd seen her. She knew I interfered. Was I in danger? Was she coming for me next? Paranoia set in. Every creak in the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to distract myself, reading books, watching TV, but nothing could hold my attention. My mind kept returning to the lake, the woman, the missing family. I felt a deep sense of guilt, a responsibility for what had happened. If only I'd known about the legend, if only I'd been more careful. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch, trying to get some sun, when I saw a figure approaching down the street. It was an old woman, small and hunched over, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. She wore a long, dark dress and a shawl over her head, obscuring her face. My heart pounded in my chest. Was it her? Had she come for me? The woman stopped in front of my house, her gaze fixed on me. I couldn't see her eyes, but I could feel them boring into me, filled with an ancient wisdom and a deep sadness. You are the ranger, she said, her voice raspy and low. I nodded, my throat tight. You have seen her, the woman continued. The Bell Witch. I swallowed hard. Yes. The woman sighed. She is a powerful spirit, angered by the intrusion of man. She has been taking souls for centuries, lost souls who wander too close to her domain. The family. I whispered. They are lost, the woman said. Lost to the darkness. There is no bringing them back. I felt a wave of despair wash over me. They were gone, forever. The woman reached out, her hand gnarled and wrinkled, and touched my arm. I flinched, but she held my gaze. You are in danger, Ranger, she said. The Bell Witch is angry. She will not forgive your interference. I felt a chill run down my spine. What can I do? That night, I packed a bag. I didn't take much, just the essentials. Some clothes, a few books, my laptop. I left everything else behind. My house, my job, my life in Yosemite. It all felt like a distant memory now, a dream that had turned into a nightmare. I left a note for Johnson, explaining everything. I told him about the old woman, her warning, my decision to leave. I asked him to be careful, to watch out for the Bell Witch. I drove through the night, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a desperate need to get as far away from Cathedral Lake as possible. Every time I saw a lake or a pond in the distance, my heart would pound in my chest, and I would grip the steering wheel tighter. I ended up in a small town, somewhere in Nevada. I rented a cheap motel room and tried to get some sleep. But the nightmares continued. The woman in the boat, the pink backpack, the abandoned campsite, they all haunted my dreams. I spent the next few days wandering around the town, trying to find some sense of normalcy. I went to the library, read the newspaper, ate at a diner. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the Bell Witch was still out there, searching for me. One day, I was walking through a park when I saw a young girl playing on the swings. She had a pink backpack, just like the one I had found at the lake. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. I turned and walked away, my hands trembling. I couldn't escape the memories, the guilt, the fear. The Bell Witch had taken that family, and she would never let me forget it. I knew I could never go back to Yosemite. I could never be a park ranger again. The forest held too many dark secrets, too many painful memories. But I also knew that I couldn't keep running. I had to face my fears, confront the trauma. I had to find a way to live with what I had seen, with what I had lost. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that I had to keep moving forward, one step at a time. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but I had to keep going. I had to find a way to heal, to find peace. And maybe, just maybe, someday I would be able to return to the forest, to the place where it all began. But for now, I had to keep moving, keep searching, keep hoping. The Bell Witch might have taken their souls, but she wouldn't take mine. I would not let her win. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the eastern sky as I hoisted my backpack onto my shoulders. The air was crisp and cool, with the smell of pine needles and damp earth filling my nostrils. I took a deep breath, savoring the moment, and then set off on the trail. I had been planning this solo hike through the Appalachian Mountains for months. It was something I had always wanted to do, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of everyday life and reconnect with nature. I had heard stories about the strange and mysterious things that happen in these mountains, but I had always dismissed them as folklore. I was a man of science, and I didn't believe in the supernatural. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. I followed the well-worn path, enjoying the peaceful solitude of the forest. The only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves under my feet. I felt a sense of calm and contentment that I hadn't experienced in years. As the day wore on, however, I began to notice that the trail was becoming less defined. The trees seemed to be closing in on me, and the forest was growing darker. I checked my map, but I couldn't find my current location. I started to feel a sense of unease, but I told myself that I was just lost. I continued hiking, hoping to find my way back to the main trail. But the further I went, the more disoriented I became. The sun was beginning to set, and the forest was growing darker by the minute. I knew that I needed to find a place to camp for the night, but I didn't want to wander too far off the trail. Finally, I came to a small clearing. It was the perfect spot to set up my tent. I quickly gathered some firewood and started a small fire. As the flames crackled and danced, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was safe, for now. As I sat by the fire, eating my dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything. I told myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling persisted. After dinner, I crawled into my tent and zipped it up tight. I lay there, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, and the branches creaked and groaned. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching me. Just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard a noise outside my tent. It was a soft scratching sound, like something was trying to get in. I held my breath, listening intently. The scratching continued, and then I heard a low growl. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was out there, but I knew that it was something dangerous. I lay perfectly still, hoping that whatever it was would go away. But the growling only got louder. And then I heard something heavy moving around outside my tent. I could feel the ground shaking beneath me. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I was all alone in the middle of the wilderness, and something was trying to get into my tent. Suddenly, the growling stopped. I held my breath, listening for any sound, but there was only silence. I waited for what seemed like an eternity, but the silence continued. I slowly started to relax. Maybe whatever it was had gone away. Just as I was about to let out a sigh of relief, I heard a loud ripping sound. I looked up and saw that the tent fabric was being torn away from the frame. I screamed in terror as something large and dark reached into the tent. I could feel its hot breath on my face. And then everything went black. I woke up with a gasp, my heart pounding in my chest. I was drenched in sweat, and my tent was in tatters. I scrambled out of the wreckage, my eyes darting around frantically. But there was nothing there. The sun was shining brightly, and the birds were singing. It was as if the events of the previous night had never happened. But I knew they had. I could still feel the creature's hot breath on my face, and I could still see its dark shape looming over me. I quickly packed up my tent and the rest of my gear, eager to get away from that clearing. I didn't know what had attacked me, but I knew that I didn't want to stick around to find out. I hiked for hours, not stopping until I reached a ranger station. I told the ranger about my experience, but he just laughed it off. He said that I had probably just had a bad dream. I didn't believe him, but I didn't argue. I knew that I wouldn't be able to convince him. I thanked him for his time and then continued on my way. I was shaken by my experience, but I was determined to finish my hike. I had come too far to turn back now. However, I was more cautious now. I kept my eyes peeled for any sign of the creature, and I made sure to camp in well-lit areas. I also started to pay more attention to the sounds of the forest. I noticed that there were fewer birds singing, and the animals seemed to be more skittish. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One night, I was camped near a stream. I had just finished eating my dinner when I heard a noise in the bushes. I froze, listening intently. The noise came again. It was a soft scratching sound, like something was trying to get through the undergrowth. I slowly reached for my knife, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was out there, but I was ready for it. The scratching sound got closer, and then I saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes staring at me from the darkness. I gasped and stumbled backward, my knife clattering to the ground. The creature stepped out of the bushes, and I got my first good look at it. It was tall and gaunt, with long, sharp claws. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its eyes glowed with an eerie light. I knew then that I was in trouble. This was no ordinary animal. This was something else. Something evil. The creature let out a low growl, and I knew that it was time to run. I turned and fled, the creature hot on my heels. I ran as fast as I could, but the creature was faster. It was gaining on me. I could hear its heavy breathing behind me, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before it caught me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw that the creature was right behind me. Its claws were outstretched, ready to tear me to shreds. I closed my eyes and braced for the impact, but it never came. I opened my eyes and saw that the creature was gone. I was alone. I didn't know how I had escaped, but I was grateful. I knew that I had been given a second chance. I quickly gathered my things and continued on my way. I didn't know what the creature was, or why it was after me, but I knew that I had to get out of those mountains as soon as possible. The encounter with the red-eyed creature had shaken me to my core. I couldn't shake the image of its gaunt frame and those glowing eyes. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. I was starting to regret this whole solo hiking trip. Maybe those campfire stories about the mountains weren't just stories after all. I pushed on, though. Turning back now felt impossible. I needed to get to the next town, find a motel, and seriously consider if I wanted to continue. But the trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, winding through dense woods with no sign of civilization. As dusk began to settle, I stumbled upon an old, weathered sign nailed to a tree. It looked like it had been there for decades, the paint peeling and the wood rotting. Curiosity got the better of me, and I moved closer to read it. The sign depicted a crudely drawn figure, tall, emaciated, with what looked like animalistic features. Underneath, in faded red paint, were the words, "Danger, Skinwalker." I felt a chill run down my spine. Skinwalker. I had heard whispers of these creatures before, local legends about shape-shifting beings that roamed the mountains. But I had always dismissed them as folklore, just spooky stories to tell around a campfire. Now, after what I had seen, I wasn't so sure. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a prank, some locals trying to scare hikers. Or maybe it was a genuine warning, a remnant of some old, forgotten danger. Either way, it was enough to make my skin crawl. I hurried on. The image of the sign burned into my mind. The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows deeper. I felt a constant sense of being watched, of being hunted. The weight of my backpack felt heavier, each step an effort. As darkness closed in, I found a small, sheltered spot to make camp. I gathered some fallen branches, my hands shaking as I struggled to light a fire. The flames provided little comfort, their flickering light dancing on the surrounding trees, making the shadows seem even more menacing. I ate a meager dinner, my appetite gone. Every sound, the crackling of the fire, the hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, made me jump. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like prey waiting for the predator to strike. Exhaustion finally overtook me, and I crawled into my sleeping bag. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, eyes wide open, listening to the sounds of the night, every nerve on high alert. The image of the Skinwalker sign, the red eyes in the darkness, kept flashing through my mind. I wasn't sure if I believed in the supernatural, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer alone in these mountains. Something was out there, and it was watching me. I woke to the sound of birdsong, a surprisingly normal sound after the terror of the previous night. Sunlight filtered through the trees, dappling the forest floor. For a moment, I almost felt safe. Almost. But the memory of the red eyes, the feeling of being hunted, quickly returned. I packed up my camp with a renewed sense of urgency. I needed to get out of these woods. The trail seemed to be leading me deeper into the wilderness, though. The trees grew denser, the air thicker, the silence more profound. I felt a growing sense of isolation, like I was the only human being left on Earth. As the day wore on, I started to notice things that I hadn't before. Strange symbols carved into tree trunks, piles of rocks arranged in unnatural patterns, a sense of unseen eyes following my every move. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, but the feeling persisted. Towards evening, I decided to make camp early. I found a clearing near a small stream, hoping the sound of running water would offer some comfort. I gathered firewood, built a fire, and cooked a simple meal. But as I sat by the fire, eating my dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the shadows, but I couldn't see anything. Then, I heard it. A twig snapping in the darkness just beyond the edge of the firelight. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I listened intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Maybe it was just an animal, I told myself. A deer or a squirrel. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I added more wood to the fire, trying to push back the encroaching darkness. But the shadows seemed to grow deeper, the silence more oppressive. Suddenly, I heard another sound. A low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the darkness beyond the firelight. I felt a chill run down my spine. I grabbed my knife, my hand trembling. I knew I was in danger, but I didn't know what to do. Should I run? Should I hide? Should I fight? The growling grew louder, closer. I could hear something moving in the undergrowth, something large and heavy. I held my breath, listening intently. The creature was circling me, getting closer with every passing second. Then I saw it. A pair of glowing red eyes, staring at me from the darkness. The creature stepped into the firelight, and I got my first good look at it. It was tall and gaunt, with long, sharp claws and a snarling mouth full of razor-sharp teeth. Its fur was matted and dirty, and its eyes glowed with an eerie light. I knew then that I was facing something truly evil. Something that wasn't meant to exist in this world. The creature lunged at me, its claws outstretched. I screamed and raised my knife, but it was too late. The creature was upon me, its weight knocking me to the ground. I struggled to fight back, but the creature was too strong. It pinned me to the ground, its claws digging into my flesh. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end, but it never came. Instead, I heard a loud crack, like a branch snapping. Then, the creature's weight was lifted from me. I opened my eyes and saw that the creature was gone. I was alone. I lay there for a moment, catching my breath, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Then, I slowly got to my feet. I looked around, but there was no sign of the creature. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. I didn't know how I had escaped, but I was grateful. I knew that I had been given another chance. I quickly gathered my things and fled into the darkness, not stopping until I was far away from that clearing. I didn't know what the creature was, or why it was after me. But I knew that I had to get out of those mountains as soon as possible. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those red eyes, felt the creature's weight on me, its hot breath on my face. I kept replaying the attack in my mind, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out how I had escaped. But there were no answers. Dawn finally broke, and I stumbled out of my makeshift shelter, exhausted and terrified. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I just knew I had to get out of those mountains. I started hiking again, but my heart wasn't in it. I was no longer enjoying the beauty of the wilderness. All I could see was the danger lurking around every corner. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature following me. But there was nothing there. Just the endless trees and the oppressive silence. I started to wonder if I was going crazy. Maybe the creature was just a figment of my imagination. Maybe I was hallucinating from exhaustion and fear. But then I would remember the feeling of its claws digging into my flesh, the smell of its foul breath, the sound of its growling. No, it was real. I knew it was real. I decided to change my plans. I was originally going to hike the entire Appalachian Trail, but now I just wanted to get out of these mountains as quickly as possible. I decided to head towards the nearest town, even if it meant going off trail. I hiked for hours, pushing myself to my limits. I didn't stop to rest or eat. I just kept going, driven by fear and desperation. As the sun began to set, I came to a clearing. In the distance, I could see the lights of a town. I felt a surge of relief. I was almost safe. But then I heard it. The sound of a twig snapping behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly turned around, and there it was. The creature, standing at the edge of the clearing, its red eyes glowing in the twilight. It was closer than ever before. I could see the details of its face, the sharp teeth, the matted fur. It was even more terrifying up close. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I had to fight. I grabbed my knife and charged at the creature, screaming at the top of my lungs. The creature lunged at me, its claws outstretched. We clashed in a flurry of violence. I slashed at the creature with my knife, but it was like trying to cut through stone. The creature's claws raked across my chest, tearing through my clothes and flesh. I fell to the ground, the creature on top of me. I could feel its hot breath on my face, its claws digging into my flesh. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But it never came. Instead, I heard a gunshot. The creature's weight was lifted from me, and I heard it yelping in pain. I opened my eyes and saw a man standing over me, a rifle in his hands. He was wearing a camouflage jacket and had a stern look on his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. I nodded, still in shock. The man looked at the creature, which was now lying on the ground, whimpering. "It's a skinwalker," he said. "They're dangerous creatures. You're lucky to be alive." I got to my feet, my body aching. I looked at the man, grateful for his help. "Thank you," I said. "You saved my life." The man nodded. "You're welcome. But you need to get out of these mountains. It's not safe here." I nodded again. I knew he was right. The man helped me to my feet and led me towards the town. As we walked, I looked back at the clearing where the creature lay dead. I felt a sense of relief, but also a sense of dread. I knew that I would never forget what had happened in those mountains. I would never forget the Skinwalker. The man, who introduced himself as Dale, took me back to his cabin, a small, rustic building nestled deep in the woods. He patched me up, the wounds from the Skinwalker's claws surprisingly deep. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He seemed to understand the terror I had experienced, the sheer disbelief of encountering something so unnatural. As he cleaned the gashes on my arm and chest, he told me about the Skinwalkers. He said they were more than just legends, that they were real and dangerous. He said they were drawn to fear, to the scent of blood. He said I was lucky to be alive. I listened, trying to process everything. Dale's matter-of-fact tone, the way he spoke about these creatures like they were just another part of the local wildlife, was both unsettling and strangely comforting. It made the whole thing seem almost normal, like encountering a bear or a mountain lion, just on a whole other level of terrifying. Dale gave me some food and a place to sleep. I collapsed on the bed, exhausted and still reeling from the attack. But sleep wouldn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside the window sent my heart racing. I kept seeing the Skinwalker's eyes, hearing its growls. Dale sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. He seemed to sense my fear. "Don't worry," he said, his voice gruff but reassuring. "It won't come back here. Not with me around." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Then Dale spoke again. "You shouldn't have been out there alone," he said. "The mountains are no place for a lone hiker, especially not this time of year." I nodded, knowing he was right. I had been foolish, arrogant, to think I could conquer the wilderness on my own. I had underestimated the power of the mountains, the ancient forces that lurked within them. "What are you going to do now?" Dale asked. I shrugged. "I don't know," I said. "I guess I'll go back to town, try to figure things out." Dale nodded. "That's probably for the best," he said. "But be careful. The Skinwalker may be gone, but there are other things out there. Things you don't want to mess with." I shivered, his words sending a fresh wave of fear through me. I had seen enough of the supernatural to last a lifetime. The next morning, Dale drove me back to town. He dropped me off at a small motel, wished me luck, and then drove away. I watched him go, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and loneliness. I checked into the motel and took a long, hot shower. I tried to wash away the dirt and grime of the past few days, but I couldn't wash away the memories. The Skinwalker, the attack, the fear, it was all still there, etched into my mind. I sat on the bed, staring at the wall, trying to figure out what to do next. I had planned this trip for months, saved up money, taken time off work. And now it was all ruined. I felt lost, adrift. I didn't know where to go or what to do with my life. Then I remembered Dale's words, "There are other things out there." A shiver ran down my spine. What did he mean by that? Were there other creatures lurking in the mountains? Other dangers I didn't even know about? I decided I needed to find out. I needed to learn more about the Skinwalkers, about the supernatural forces that inhabited these mountains. Maybe then I could understand what had happened to me. Maybe then I could find some peace. I opened my laptop and started searching for information on Skinwalkers. I found websites, forums, even a few books. I read everything I could find, trying to piece together the truth. The more I learned, the more disturbed I became. The Skinwalkers were real. They were ancient, powerful beings, and they were not to be trifled with. I also learned that I wasn't the only one who had encountered them. There were others, people who had seen them, been attacked by them, even killed by them. I felt a growing sense of dread. I had stumbled into something far bigger than myself, something dark and dangerous. And I didn't know how to get out of it. I drove for hours, the highway stretching out before me like an endless ribbon of asphalt. I didn't have a destination in mind, just a desperate need to put as much distance between myself and the mountains as possible. The further I drove, the more I felt the tension easing, the fear receding. But it never completely disappeared. It was always there, lurking in the shadows of my mind, a constant reminder of what I had seen, what I had experienced. I stopped for the night at a roadside motel, a generic, forgettable place with flickering fluorescent lights and a musty smell. I checked in, got the key to my room, and collapsed on the bed, exhausted. But sleep wouldn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I kept replaying the events of the past few days, trying to make sense of it all. The Skinwalker, Dale, the escape, the fear, it was all a jumbled mess in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still in danger, that the Skinwalker was still out there, hunting me. I got up and went to the window. I looked out at the parking lot, the highway, the dark, empty fields beyond. There was nothing there. Just the silence of the night and the occasional passing car. I tried to tell myself that I was safe, that the Skinwalker couldn't possibly have followed me this far. But the fear was still there, gnawing at me. I went back to bed and tried to sleep, but it was no use. I tossed and turned, my mind filled with images of the creature, its glowing red eyes, its sharp claws. Finally, I gave up and got out of bed. I went to the bathroom and splashed some water on my face. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. My eyes were bloodshot, my face pale and drawn. I looked like I hadn't slept in days. I went back to the room and sat down on the bed. I didn't know what to do. I felt lost, alone, and terrified. Then I had an idea. I reached into my backpack and pulled out my laptop. I opened it up and connected to the motel's Wi-Fi. I opened my web browser and typed in Skinwalkers. I spent the next few hours reading everything I could find about these creatures. I read about their history, their powers, their weaknesses. I read about people who had encountered them, people who had been attacked by them, people who had been killed by them. The more I read, the more I realized that I was in way over my head. The Skinwalkers were not just creatures of myth and legend. They were real, and they were dangerous. And I had made the mistake of attracting their attention. I closed my laptop and leaned back on the bed, feeling overwhelmed. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to protect myself. Then I remembered something Dale had said. They're drawn to fear. I realized that he was right. The more I feared the Skinwalkers, the more powerful they became. I had to find a way to overcome my fear. I took a deep breath and closed my eyes. I tried to clear my mind, to focus on something else. I thought about my family, my friends, my life back home. Slowly, the fear began to subside. It wasn't gone completely, but it was manageable. I opened my eyes and felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in days. I knew that I still had a long way to go, but I also knew that I could face whatever came my way. I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. I woke up the next morning feeling more rested than I had in days. The fear was still there, but it was a dull ache now, not the sharp, piercing pain it had been before. I knew I wasn't out of the woods yet, but I felt like I was finally starting to regain control of my life. I decided to head west. I didn't have any particular destination in mind, just a vague sense that I needed to put as much distance between myself and the Appalachian Mountains as possible. I figured I'd keep driving until I found a place that felt safe, a place where I could start to rebuild my life. The landscape changed as I drove. The lush green forests of the east gave way to rolling hills and vast plains. The air grew drier, the sun hotter. I felt like I was leaving the past behind, driving towards an uncertain future. I stopped for the night in a small town somewhere in the Midwest. I found a motel on the outskirts of town, a quiet place with a friendly owner. I checked in and got the key to my room. It was a simple room, but it was clean and comfortable. I felt a sense of relief washing over me. For the first time in days, I felt safe. I went out for dinner at a local diner. I sat at the counter and ordered a burger and fries. The food was simple, but it tasted delicious. I savored every bite, enjoying the feeling of normalcy. After dinner, I went back to the motel and watched some TV. I flipped through the channels, but nothing caught my interest. I was too restless, too on edge. I couldn't relax. I got up and went to the window. I looked out at the town, the quiet streets, the houses with their lights on. It all seemed so peaceful, so normal. I longed to be a part of that normalcy, to leave the fear and the paranoia behind. But I knew it wasn't that easy. The Skinwalker was still out there, somewhere. And I didn't know if I would ever be truly safe. I went back to bed and tried to sleep. But it was no use. I tossed and turned, my mind filled with thoughts of the creature. I could see its glowing red eyes, its sharp claws. I could hear its growls. I got up and went to the bathroom. I splashed some water on my face and looked in the mirror. I looked tired, haggard. The fear was taking its toll on me. I went back to the room and sat down on the bed. I didn't know what to do. I felt lost and alone. Then I remembered something Dale had said. You're not alone. He had told me that there were others like me, people who had encountered the Skinwalkers. He had said that there were ways to protect myself, ways to fight back. I decided to find those people. I decided to learn how to fight back. I opened my laptop and started searching for information on Skinwalkers. I found websites, forums, even a few books. I read everything I could find, trying to learn as much as I could about these creatures. I learned that they were powerful beings, but they weren't invincible. There were ways to defeat them, ways to protect myself. I also learned that there were others like me, people who had encountered the Skinwalkers and survived. These people had formed communities, support groups, where they could share their experiences and help each other. I found one of these communities online and reached out. I told them my story, and they welcomed me with open arms. They offered me support, advice, and encouragement. For the first time since my encounter with the Skinwalker, I felt like I wasn't alone. The online community became my lifeline. They were people who understood what I was going through, people who didn't think I was crazy. They shared their own stories, offered advice, and helped me to understand the nature of the threat I faced. I learned that skinwalkers weren't just mindless monsters. They were cunning, intelligent creatures driven by a dark hunger. They were attracted to fear, to negativity, to weakness. And they were drawn to those who had seen them, who knew their true nature. I also learned that there were ways to protect myself. Certain herbs and rituals could ward them off, and certain weapons could harm them. But the most important thing was to stay strong, to stay positive, to never give in to fear. I started following their advice. I carried protective charms, practiced meditation and visualization techniques, and learned how to use firearms. I felt a sense of empowerment, a sense of control that I hadn't felt in a long time. I continued to travel, moving from town to town, never staying in one place for too long. I kept in touch with the online community, sharing my experiences and learning from theirs. I felt like I was part of something bigger than myself, a network of survivors fighting back against the darkness. But the fear never completely went away. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of the danger I faced. I knew that the skinwalkers were still out there, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. One night, I was staying in a motel in a small town in Colorado. I had been there for a few days, and I was starting to feel comfortable. I had let my guard down. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching at my window. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I looked at the window, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The scratching continued. I got out of bed and went to the window. I cautiously pulled back the curtain, and there it was. The skinwalker. It was standing outside my window, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. It was staring at me, its face contorted in a snarl. I felt a surge of fear, but I pushed it down. I remembered what I had learned. I remembered the protective charms, the meditation techniques, the firearms training. I reached under my pillow and grabbed my gun. I pointed it at the window and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the night. The skinwalker screamed and staggered back. It disappeared into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing, my gun still in my hand. I had faced my fear, and I had won. But I knew that the fight wasn't over. The skinwalkers were still out there, and they would be back. But I was ready for them. I was no longer a victim. I was a warrior. I continued to travel, moving from town to town, always on the lookout for the skinwalkers. I knew that I would never be truly safe, but I was determined to live my life, to not let the fear control me. I had faced the darkness, and I had survived. And that was something to be proud of.